Hi, good morning, and welcome to the last session for the UNET Human Resources Management. We are looking at covering today the fourth learning outcome, which is contemporary issues affecting human resource management. And before I start, what I want to do is just do a quick recap in terms of what we've covered in the first three learning outcomes so far. I think the first one, when we started this unit about 3 weeks back, what we did was we understood, we started off with basically the history and background about human resources and how this particular, faculty came about, what is the nature and, the scope of HRM, how the human resources department has kind of cemented its role over the decades, in the organization, and how this department is then responsible for, obviously measuring, organizational performance. We also looked at the differences between, HRM, when we use different acronyms like HRM, Human Resources Management, Human Resources Development. We also look at, HR, Human Resources Planning. And then to a certain extent, what we also understood was what are the key functions which Human Resources Department, or management as a function does within the organization. Things like, payroll, selection, recruitment, staffing, employee relations, training and development, and those 5 basic functions that we are aware of. Towards the end of learning outcome 1, we basically looked at the roles and responsibilities of HR managers, and we discussed with relation to a few examples in terms of how and what are the modern day roles and responsibilities of HR managers within the organization. We then went into learning outcome 2, and what we did was with learning outcome 2, we looked at focusing on the soft and hard approaches of HRM, understood a bit of theoretical models, the guest and story model, what these approaches and how these approaches help, how they help the organization in terms of the organizational culture, the structure of the organization, how does the human resources planning work, and then effectively we looked at some of the recruitment and selection techniques which the modern day HR managers today utilize. In learning outcome 3, we looked at moving on from understanding the role of HR, the structure of the organization, to understanding things like when the job description is set, how does the evaluation of that job description happen. So we looked at getting into 2 key concepts which were predominantly performance management. How is the performance of the employees, staff evaluated within the company, and then we also looked at reward management strategies. How does the HR department today decide on rewards, incentives, which are basically nothing but incentives, pay perks, between different employees at different levels, grade, and the pay and related packages. We also looked at how the evaluation of the job is done, or job description is done, and briefly focused on the techniques like management by objectives, and also the balanced scorecard, which is and the 360-degree feedback which some of the modern day organizations use. Now, coming to the last learning outcome, which is basically about contemporary issues in management. Contemporary issues in management, we will look at this in a bit more detail, because when we look at when we've understood so far the role of HR, the types of roles that they play, the responsibilities of the HR manager, and what are the key things that they're involved in. What we at some stage want to do is, what are the key issues which currently the HR managers kind of deal with on an ongoing basis. So contemporary issue, when we look at just the term, is defined as an event, idea, or an opinion which is given, which is in a given subject is relevant to present day. That means it's an issue which could be an ongoing issue. This is an issue which can be found in almost, let's put it this way, all companies or across the world, whether they are, local companies, national companies, or multinational companies. So here the idea is we want to kind of discuss, certain types of issues which are ongoing, and these issues, can be typically issues which can be, faced by any HR manager within the context of, an organization. Now, some of these issues that we looked at in the, previous, say, for example, a number of years back, when we look at some of these issues were things like sexual discrimination. There were issues around training and development. There were issues about discrimination. There were issues about pay packages. Why one of the key issues which is now currently being addressed is the pay gender gap, between men and women in most organizations in the UK. So these are contemporary issues, that why should a woman get paid less as compared to a man who's doing the same job in the same kind of role within the same organization. Now, these are issues which are called contemporary issues, and because they are ongoing issues and they could be affected by, factors which are both internal and external to the organization. Sometimes you will see that certain laws are being passed, legislation is being passed by the government because they need to address these issues more at the fundamental policy level. So what we do get to see is that these issues, which are ongoing issues, are the issues which the HR managers face, and this is what we're going to discuss in today's learning outcome. Now, my approach to understanding and discussing some of the contemporary issues, is that we want to look at essentially, modern issues which most HR managers are currently facing. So there are issues, there are lots of them. So, don't get me wrong, there are lots of issues which can fall into this particular category. Sometimes we do see that these issues are defined as, stress. These issues could be burnouts, when we hear about, people working very hard, working very fast, they're rising and climbing the ladder within the organization quite fast, which are called burnout cases. We will also look at, issues which are related to technology, because technology then poses or provides, lots of different types of challenges now within organizations. So there are different types of these issues that we get to see, and some of these issues, are contemporary issues for organizations. So when we look at a bit of a, holistic approach, my idea here will be to kind of cover some of the issues which are now present in modern day organization. When we look at the likes of Facebook, Deliveroo, we look at LinkedIn, Google, these kind of organizations. So let's start by discussing, some of the key areas going to contemporary issues. Now, as you know, that most human resources departments now, within any company are quite different of how they worked and looked in terms of their structure, the responsibilities and the roles that they did maybe a decade ago. So if I compare an HR manager's role today in 2018 or, in this decade to the role of an HR manager in the previous decade, what we'll find is that the roles were slightly different. I think what has happened over the years is because of the changing nature of the job market and the regulatory demands which have been now put in place by different governments, compliance, for example, has forced HR managers to become, and think from a point of view of, strategic importance. That means some of these issues which were not even anticipated have to be now looked at from a point of view of being, addressed, and they have to come up with policies and procedures which primarily were not even, there. So from our point of view, when we look at, some of these issues which are coming up, we do see that the HR managers are now facing issues which they have to kind of, quickly react to. Nimble, the word that I've used here, basically means that they have to be quick and, they are responsive. So most HR managers have to be very quick in terms of their understanding of these issues, pick them up very, early in the stage, and then look at coming up with solutions. So let's look at some of the issues that I think are important. Now, and I'll give you some examples primarily from the UK market, and because some of these changes are coming across in the most developed countries where, the millennial businesses, or as we say, the organizations which are predominantly, the startup companies, the big startup companies are coming through, countries like UK, US in particular. Now, the gig economy. Now, gig economy is a big issue is because a lot of people are now deciding to do flexible work. They do not want to work full time. They want to kind of fit work around their lifestyle, and they want to work and get different, they want to work in a different kind of a pattern, wherein that would mean that they want to work for many customers. They want to have difference in terms of the work that they do on a daily basis. And in that case, what they want to do is they want to work as a self-employed or on a freelance basis, as against the concept which was like, okay, let's get a job and let's get a job for life. So if you look at 10 years back, 15 years back, people wanted to get into permanent roles so that they could have pension benefits, one job, and, stability and security. But nowadays, when you look at the gig economy, here people are, kind of more talented, or they have multifaceted talent because of the influx of technology and, a lot of skills that they've been able to rack up as they grow, the millennial organization, generation in particular. So what they want is flexibility in their work. in their life, which allows them to get flexibility in their lifestyle. And this, for some, is a great selling point. So when we look at the likes of Uber, for example, the car taxi sharing service, we look at the likes of Facebook, Deliveroo. Some of these organizations, what they want to do is they want to reduce their overheads. They want to keep the cost, of employing people or staff within the company to a low, bare minimum. And this also suits their business model. So what they want to be able to do is work with the, youth or people who want to look at this flexibility in their lifestyle in terms of working for an employer, deciding on their own hours when they want to work. And obviously, the challenge at the back of it with HR managers is that they have to grapple with now to look at finding talent which could be retained within the organization. So sometimes you will see that people do not like the job, they end up leaving the organization because they find other opportunities elsewhere. And that is where what tends to happen is that they the HR managers find it difficult to kind of retain that talent on a long-term basis or on contracts within the organization. The second point which I will probably put up here would be things like innovation and automation. Now, as technology is influencing more and more of our lives on a day-to-day basis, what we do get to see is that a lot of advances in technology is taking up some of the functions which HR used to manage or deliver. So one such function could be training and development of employees. Now, most companies now employ, portals, which are called training and development portals, and they then allocate the trainings for the employees to be able to, go onto the portal and then kind of do self-training, because it's a combination of videos, text, books, handout presentations, and they expect that, okay, once this has been rolled out within the company, due to the technological advancement, the individual or the staff should be able to kind of train themselves. So in this case, what is happening is that in some instances, coordinating and ensuring that technology allows them to create that, the programming or the advancement in terms of deploying their training and development programs within the company creates an issue, because not all employees are good with IT, and what tends to happen is if they end up investing into that program and there is a low uptake from the employees, to look at innovation and automation, then they have to kind of look at balancing the costs and also put contingency measures in place for employees to be trained using face-to-face programs like seminars and conferences and things like that. So this is an ongoing issue, but most millennial organizations are, able to put together training and development programs using the innovation and automation, which is because of technology. Now, one of the key issues which most HR managers are now grappling with are the changing regulatory issues. As you know, that most companies are becoming multinationals. They work across different geographies, countries. There are lots of regulations, and regulation is generally considered a minefield for an HR manager. So they need to look at labor relations. They need to look at, regulatory issues, which is related to, say, pay, for example, pension. They need to look at issues like contracts. So these things have to be, kind of adjusted to where the company and the company operations are. And from that point of view, this is considered as a contemporary issue. Now, in some cases, some companies have to look at privacy laws, and these privacy laws are being constantly updated. And so in some cases, it becomes a kind of a, area wherein there is a lot of emphasis which goes in order to ensure compliance is there. So when you look at TV companies, for example, or when you look at, for example, employment laws, and because a lot of people are working across different, geographies in, say, news channel or TV companies, you will see that the employees, though employed, in the US, for example, but the company is based in the UK, so they need to be able to adhere to laws which are laws both in the UK as well as in the US, and that is where training and development needs to be done both at the employee level and also at the HR level, so that they are able to put together relevant contracts and they are not in breach of, these regulations or, legislation within different countries. Now, one of the other issues that we look at briefly would be, recruiting and retaining the top talent. Because there are lots of organizations, sometimes you see that competition would try and poach or, get hold of employees from the other organization because they want to jumpstart their business, or they want to kind of inherit that advantage of having a good employee which is able to, meet targets, achieve targets. So here, recruiting and retaining talent, is an ongoing issue with HR managers face, and sometimes they have to look at coming up with innovative pay packages, incentives, and resources, which have to be, put in line with what the competition is offering in order to retain their own staff. So this is a point which is quite self-explanatory, but to a certain extent, you see that the pay and incentives and perks essentially keep changing at different levels. The pay grades keep changing at different levels because, if they are looking at attracting, say, people, at the top level, like a chief executive or a management level, what they would tend to do is the resources with the HR managers have to look at would be to try and find talent both from internal and external sides of the organization. And a lot of companies today, say, for example, will employ LinkedIn, to be able to reach out to potential employees which they want to attract and retain in the organization. Now, the other thing that we look at is in terms of contemporary issues, one of the key things that come across is that a lot of organizations now have operations in different countries. So diversity is an issue. And what we get to see is that a lot of companies now have a lot of different types of employee and workforce working within the organization. So the HR managers have to be sensitive about the culture, the nature, and obviously the diversity of their workforce. And some of these policies, procedures which are put in place have to be put in place, keeping in mind that diversity is, within the organization. Now, look at organizations like Microsoft, Facebook, Google. They employ, people from all over the world. And when we look at, because they want to build the best teams, have the best talent working on the products they come out with, they want to ensure that, they are able to retain, recruit, and also have the best talent available to the organization. Now, in that case, they do not look at just recruiting in the US, UK, or developed countries. They go to Far East, they go to countries wherein they feel the skill set and, obviously that important edge is available. And because when they recruit in those locations, there are lots of people which work within the organizations which come from different culture, and they look at, for example, they have different beliefs and, they've worked in different geographies. There, that issue of diversity then tends to pose, for example, a serious challenge to some of the HR managers. So here they have to put policies in place, laws in place, which ensure the company, the employees working with the company actually follow the protocol. The training programs have to be put in place. Some of them will have to be trained appropriately to understand the corporate culture or the company culture and how they need to then work within the teams to be able to deliver the goals and objectives. So in order to look at diversity issues, most HR departments, managers would look at, doing training and workshops, and that is to build close working within teams, or build cohesive teams essentially, so that they are able to work together and understand the other individuals working within the organization. Now, having understood that, let's look at how contemporary issues kind of also have a bit of an impact from the legislation and regulation which is put in place within the within the, for example, HR department. Now, there are lots of legislation which come into play, and obviously some of these can be classified as employment legislation. So when we look at employment legislation, what we do get to see is that these are laws which basically have to be followed by HR managers or an organization when they tend to employ staff workers or have a workforce in place. So employment legislation could be defined as a law which governs employment within the workforce with everyone who works in that location. So here the legislation would cover not just the employer but employees and also unions. So if I have to just describe the employee legislation, what I would do is put this definition here, which would kind of say that, okay, it covers both the employer, employee, and the unions, in some cases, and that would constitute something called employee legislation. Now, that would basically mean, what are the laws which govern employment in a particular country. Now, some of the key laws that I've put together on the slide, and they relate to the indicative content, have been put across. So there is something called the Discrimination Act, Equalities Act, the European Working Time Directive, Employment Relations, Data Protection, which is now changed to, the GDPR Act in the UK and in Europe. And then, we look at employment rights and, obviously, rule of employment tribunals. Now, when we look at, so what I've done is I've put together one slide just to explain the law very briefly, and then if more details are required, I've put in the link from which we can get some more information about this law. Now, the first one very briefly would be the Sexual Discrimination Act of 1935. Here, basically, it says that, in the United Kingdom, I'm just taking an example of UK and most of these laws, is that, the Parliament actually came out with this act in 1975, and it said that there has to be no discrimination on the grounds of sex or marital status. So here, the act actually, when employers put out an advert, they cannot say that we want, somebody who's a bachelor or not married, or they cannot advertise or put adverts in the market, in the job market, or the job advertisements which clearly say that we would prefer to have a male within this role, or we would prefer to have a female within this role. So basically, discrimination on the basis of sex and marital status, and say for example on the basis of training, education, is not allowed. So employers have to be very careful when they place out adverts, for vacancies. They have to ensure that they are complying with this particular act. The next one is called the Equalities Act of 2010. Now, these acts have also been updated over the years. So, the reason why I put in the Act of 1975 is that it was introduced in the Parliament as an act, and it became an act in that year, and then obviously revisions keep happening in this particular act, and the link that I put in should be able to give you guidance on, the updates and other bits if you want to go into a bit more detail. Now, the Equalities Act basically says that it protects people from discrimination in workplace and in wider society. That means employers are not able to discriminate against any particular sex, culture, or caste. And what they have to do is they have to make policies and procedures and put it out in such a way that it is easier for people to understand without having to feel being discriminated on the basis of Equalities Act. So a lot of companies now have something called the Equality and Diversity policy in place, which they say that the job, when it is advertised, is open to all types of people. We do not discriminate, and any caste, culture, religion, or type of people can apply for a particular job role within a company. So this policy or this act now is seen in most organizations as an equality and diversity policy. Now, the European Working Time Directive says that you cannot work more than 48 hours a week on an average for up to certain number of weeks. Now, this law basically defines that if you're working, basically there is a definition of working hours and the timing of working hours. So if somebody is to work up to 37.5 hours, that is considered full-time work. If somebody works up to 25 hours, that is considered between 16 to 25 hours is considered part-time work. So here, what we are looking at is the European Working Time Directive actually says that you cannot work for more than 48 hours a week or across 17 weeks. Now, this is done in order to ensure that the employers are not able to take advantage of workers and make them work unusually long hours. But in this case, if they have a requirement, for people to be able to work within the company, they should then employ additional people to work within those hours. And here, this particular directive then ensures that people under the age of 18 cannot work more than 8 hours a day or 40 hours a week. So this particular, legislation basically says that, there are some exceptions to this, wherein you can work for more than 48 hours a week across or more than 17 weeks. And there would be people in armed forces, for example, emergency services, A&E emergencies and accident services or surveillance. And those kind of things, allow, longer working hours. So from our point of view, when we look at, understanding this particular bit, what we want to do is, it is to understand, how many hours you can be employed for within the company and what that constitutes in terms of pay and obviously full-time work or part-time work. Now, Employment Legislation Act of 1999 was an act which was introduced in the Parliament in 1999. It has significant amendments in the case of UK labour laws and laws related to trade unions and labour relations. Now, this particular act that we look at is basically bringing across changes to the laws which were actually put in place with regards to employment earlier and it consolidated the Trade Unions and Labour Relation Act of 1992 into the Employment Relations Act. Now here basically the government introduced an act to say that the trade unions, labour relation, they should work in tandem and it also included something called the employment agencies and how they provide manpower or people to the organizations on a supply basis. So if you are involved in recruitment and you're able to basically recruit people on behalf of agencies on behalf of the company, then this basically meant that you had to comply with this particular law. Now, Data Protection Act of 1998 has now changed into something called the GDPR Act, which is primarily the General Data Protection Regulation Act of EU, and companies were given 2 years to comply with this legislation, and this comes into place on the 25th of May in the United Kingdom. Now, Data Protection Act basically allowed, was put in place in terms of how the companies or organizations share, store, and keep data of personal data of individuals. So because with the advent of computers and digital media, a lot of data and records, personal data and records, were now kept in electronic records, and that is where that Data Protection Act regulation came in. And this has been revised over the years. In the UK, this regulation is called the Data Protection Act, but this basically controls how much information about an individual can the organization or business or the government keep, and if this data is kept, for certain reasons, then they have to follow what is called the data protection principles. The data has to be protected. It cannot be provided to any other individual which is not directly related with this data, and the request for such data or retrieval of the data has to happen through an appropriate data protection officer in this case, and which ensures that if at all somebody is asking or needs to look at that data, that can only be provided if they have relevant clearance or a requirement for utilizing the data. Now, there is something called the Freedom of Information Act, which basically was introduced in 2010, so that the companies, large public sector organizations, could obtain data from the Parliament or data related to public sector organizations. The press could obtain that data, under the data of the Data of Information Freedom Act, and that allowed them to get hold of the operations and the workings of the company, the Parliament, under this act, to share that with the public. So this was primarily introduced for the media. Now, very briefly looking at the updates which are happening to Data Protection Act, and that will be called the GDPR Act. And this Act of 2016, basically says General Data Protection Act, which means that how the data of individuals will be protected and shared outside the European Union. So it kind of looks at putting measures into place which basically address the export of personal data outside EU member states. So, for example, if I'm a citizen of UK, how somebody from outside the EU can address and request for my data, and how that data is provided will actually be governed by the GDPR Act. Now, there are lots of things which we can discuss about GDPR, but I put some notes in the, some details or some important points in the footnotes of the slide. Now, this Data Act was introduced in 2016, and companies were given a 2-year time period to comply with this regulation. This is now coming into effect on the 25th of May 2018, and this replaces, the Data Protection Act Directive, which was introduced by the EU in 1995. So in the UK, even though we are leaving the European Union because of Brexit, but essentially what will happen is we are also updating our Data Protection Act in line with the requirements of GDPR, and all firms within the UK still have to comply with that. So it is a potential area of interest for most HR managers, and because this is a major change happening in the last I would say 28 years of the data protection regulation, this is a major change. So most HR managers are currently grappling with this and putting training and putting training and development in place for their departments and their organizations to ensure that they meet the compliance of the GDPR Act. Last but not the least, let's look at some of the basic things that when you have people working within the organizations, you have unions, you have different departments, there could be a possibility of a dispute. The government introduced something called the Employment Rights or Dispute Resolution Act of 1998, and this act basically, kind of regulated the UK labor laws. That means if in case you feel that you have been made redundant, or you have been, thrown out of the company, or you have been discriminated against, how would you appeal? Where will you take your appeal? and how will this appeal be looked into? And this particular act kind of provided the answers for that. And in the in 1998, this act basically created something called the ACAS service, which was the Advisory, Conciliation and Arbitration Service, which allowed employees to kind of put these matters of discrimination, inequality, or maybe things which they felt, things like, for example, an unfair dismissal, to this particular tribunal. And this then looked at the resolution in terms of, a favorable resolution to a dispute, and this was then done through the employment tribunals. So this particular act actually allows both employer, employee, and the unions to participate in this process. And in this process, when they participate, the idea is the ACAS service, which is the Advisory, Conciliation and Arbitration Service, looks at hearing all the sides and then brings a amicable resolution to the dispute, or the unfair, say for example, an unfair dismissal. Now, lastly, looking at the role of employment tribunals. Now, employment tribunals are basically independent judicial bodies in the UK, and they were established to kind of resolve disputes between the employers and the employees, and to protect the employment right of the employees. So it protects both the employer and also the employee, but also at the same point in time listens and gets hold of the claims which are made by employees, employers against each other. So some of the unfair, some of the claims which the employment tribunal looks into, are claims like unfair dismissal. That means you're being kind of removed from the company, or made redundant by the company without giving any notice. Discrimination, wages discrimination, or sometimes if you have not received payments in line with say what has been given on your contract. The employment tribunals, are basically public bodies, both in England, Wales, and Scotland, and they are, they are under a statutory jurisdiction. That means they have some laws and legislation which they have to follow, and they have to be, they are fair. They have to be seen as fair and neutral when they look at resolving these disputes between employers and employees, and also the unions. Now, some of these, there's a very good article which we can read and go through from a point of view of understanding the employment tribunal, and this is what I have put together as a bit of a link for you to go through, and this is an article under the CIPD. So from that point of view, this is something I would suggest that just for additional reading, it'll be good for you to kind of look at going through this particular article which talks about the role of employment tribunals. Now, what I'm going to do is, obviously, I've included some links which are going to be good at additional reading to cover this particular last learning outcome. And I've put together some other slides which give you, detailed information in terms of contemporary issues in HRM, and also the law and legislation which the HR managers have to look at while working within modern day organizations. Now, if you have any questions and any queries with regards to this particular learning outcome, I would suggest that you send me an email, and then I will, obviously send you some additional handouts, or, some additional reading material to kind of clarify and, understand that concept in a bit more detail. But apart from this, I think what I will do is, I would also suggest that since we've completed this particular unit, and then if I just briefly look at, now the, the assignment brief, my suggestion would be that here you should be in a position now to kind of, look at going through the unit and the assignment brief, and then start to submit, your assignment, start to work on your draft assignment, and you should be in a position to submit this to me just after the bank holiday weekend, on the 28th of May. So I look forward to receiving your drafts. And in the meanwhile, if you have any questions, please feel free to send them across on the email, and a copy of this presentation and the recording will also be put up on Moodle shortly. Thanks for attending. Take care, and bye.